Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christen Smith, Pennsylvania editor for the Center Square. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania reporter, Anthony Hennen. We're here today to talk about the General Assembly and how busy they were this week. For the first time since mid-January, not only do we have the House back, but we have the Senate back. So they got into it this week and decided to tell us what their official legislative priorities are going to be. So you covered this for us at thecentersquare.com. Why don't you tell us what they said?
Yeah, so much of this, Senate Republicans came out focusing on family-friendly policies and economic growth. When you look at their official cheat sheet they sent out here on strengthening Pennsylvania, the three main headlines here were protecting Pennsylvania jobs, empowering Pennsylvania families, and defending Pennsylvania freedoms. So when we kind of move past that PR speak and what they're really getting into, a lot of this focused around energy costs, inflation, but also education funding and especially like mental health investments, things like that. Joe Pittman, who is the Senate Republican Majority Leader, came out saying that we recognize that cheap energy is critical to keeping inflation under control. We have made it very clear that we as a Senate majority embrace our God-given natural resources. So this is, clearly him referencing past struggles against the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, trying to basically expand fracking and developing natural gas in the Commonwealth, essentially seeing that as key to economic growth and also keeping energy costs low in Pennsylvania. So I think that's going to be a theme that we see constantly. It's going to be interesting with the Democrats controlling the Pennsylvania House, how that will go over, but also how Governor Shapiro will shake out. He sort of was trying to walk this line of embracing Pennsylvania's energy sector while also embracing renewable energy, protecting the environment. And he is much less gung-ho than predecessor Tom Wolf was about RGGI. So I think that'll be something to keep an eye on here. But what's also I thought was interesting was during this, you had a lot of focus on family and education priorities. President pro tempore Kim Ward, who's coming out of Greensburg. She really talked up the passage last year of the child care tax credit to help families and lower costs, but also just generally investments in mental health care, funding for more support staff in nursing homes, and also giving some boost to workforce recruitment and retention payments for frontline workers. So also kind of paying attention to healthcare, to emergency medical services across the state. I think that's something to keep an eye on and something that is easier to measure than a lot of these other talking points. But, they were also talking about reducing the tax burden, cutting government red tape, other hurdles that Pennsylvania businesses might counter as they try to expand a business or start a business or hire people. So I think that these are not necessarily new talking points for Senate Republicans, but it's very much something that we expect to see at least some movement on, whether some of these become law or whether they get watered down or worked out in some sort of compromise. That's really what remains to be seen, especially with more of a divided government than the previous session.
I think your comments point exactly to what's different about this session. You're right. Their talking points here are a lot of what we've heard before, with some more family-focused policies sprinkled in, that child care tax credit and expanding it potentially in the future. That's something that's a little bit newer to their platform. But I think you bring up an interesting point about really how far is any of this going to get because of the new Democratic majority in the House. This feels a lot like, words are cheap almost, if I could say that, because although they are promising to deliver on these priorities and although they are speaking in rosy terms of bipartisanship, we all know that the actions of both chambers in the last 6 weeks have been anything but. And in fact, disagreement between the Republican majority in the Senate and the Democratic majority in the House is exactly why nobody was in session since the middle of January. So I'd be curious to hear, what is your sense that are we over that hump, or is it just going to be more gridlock?
I would approach it as I will not believe we're over the hump until we see that we're over the hump. Especially in these sorts of things, it's constantly one party will blame the other party for delaying. We did our part, we're waiting on them. It's hard to say, especially with just how narrow the margins are in the House and how quickly we went from this optimistic language about compromise and moving forward to, gridlock, backbiting, a new House Speaker, over 2 months. I would not come in thinking everything's going to be rosy and smooth. Who knows what the budget will look like over the next few years or what other political developments happen. So, it's nice to hear politicians thinking that, this is an opportunity for compromise and to improve the Commonwealth. But until we really see the nitty gritty and things actually getting done, I wouldn't hold my breath here. Not to say that there's no chances for compromise or that both parties can't actually find something to get done. I think when push comes to shove, especially on some local issues, it's not as wide of a chasm as people like to think it is. But, I take a lot of these statements with a grain of salt, aside from this is our priority. Because who knows how this will shake out.
You're absolutely right. And of course, the big wild card here is our new governor, Josh Shapiro. His first budget address is coming up next week on Tuesday, I believe. And that's when we're going to get the first look at what his spending priorities are and how much those align with the rest of the Democratic Party for the last 8 years. Tom Wolf, his predecessor, has been pretty aligned with the more progressive arm of the Democratic Party and really wanting big boosts in education spending and environmental policies. And he was committed to a natural gas severance tax for years. Of course, none of those proposals were going to get majority support in the House and the Senate. But now, as we said before, we're in a completely different situation. But Shapiro's also branded himself as a moderate, as somebody who hears both sides of the argument. And I think that's very clear when you look at his energy policy and his position on Reggie. So I think next week is going to be a really great expansion of these priorities that we've been hearing from the House and the Senate this past week. So I look forward to reading your reporting on that next week. Our listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Anthony Hennen, this is Christen Smith. Please subscribe and thanks for listening.
Freedom and liberty are important to all of us. If you're looking for civil, intellectual conversations with those shaping the future of freedom, try the Future of Freedom podcast with me, Scott Bertram. We speak with leaders across the country in the greater conservative and libertarian movements. In-depth conversations about where the next intellectual battles will happen across the country. It's the Future of Freedom podcast. Find it at americastalking.com or wherever you get your podcasts.